June 12, 1944. Normandy, France. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn, leaving the Norman hedgerows glistening like wet iron in the half-light. Generalmajor Wilhelm Richter stood at the shattered window of a farmhouse outside Caen, watching American supply trucks roll past in an unbroken column that stretched beyond the horizon. He had been awake for 36 hours. His uniform, once immaculate, now bore the dust and smoke of 6 days of retreat. In his hand, he held a piece of white bread, soft, fresh, impossibly white, given to him by an American lieutenant the previous evening when he'd been taken prisoner. He turned it over in his fingers, studying it as though it were an artifact from another world. Because in a sense it was. The bread was still warm. Richter had spent 4 years on the Eastern Front. He had commanded men through the frozen hell of Stalingrad, through the mud of Kursk, through retreats where soldiers boiled their leather belts for sustenance. He had watched boys die clutching photographs of mothers they would never see again, had signed requisition orders for ammunition when there was none, had distributed iron rations that were neither iron nor rations, but compressed sawdust mixed with animal fat. He had learned to measure warfare not in territorial gains or strategic objectives, but in calories, in grams of bread, in the slow mathematics of starvation. And now, 6 days into the Allied invasion of Europe, he stood holding a piece of bread that defied every calculation he had ever made about modern warfare. The German High Command had built its entire strategic doctrine on a simple premise. Armies move on their stomachs, and no army in history had ever moved far from its supply depots without collapsing into logistical chaos. This was not theory. This was mathematics written in blood across every map room in Berlin. Napoleon's Grand Armée had demonstrated this truth in the snows of Russia. The Kaiser's forces had proven it again in the trenches of Verdun. Even Germany's own lightning war, its vaunted blitzkrieg, had been predicated on the assumption that modern mechanized warfare consumed resources faster than any nation could possibly sustain across extended supply lines. The Führer himself had said it. The Americans are shopkeepers, not warriors. They will land their troops, and then their precious democracy will strangle their logistics. They will debate and committee and requisition form themselves into paralysis while we crush them against the sea. Generaloberst Gerd von Rundstedt had been more precise in his assessment, delivered to his staff in March of 1944. If the Anglo-Americans establish a beachhead, they will face the classic dilemma of expeditionary warfare. Every mile inland multiplies their supply requirements geometrically. Every destroyed bridge, every cratered road, every kilometer of French countryside becomes an enemy more formidable than our divisions. They will be operating at the end of a supply chain that crosses an ocean, crosses a contested beach, crosses a countryside we have spent 4 years fortifying. By the time their supplies reach the front, their offensive will have already died of starvation. This was not wishful thinking. This was orthodox military science, validated by centuries of warfare. The Germans had studied the American Civil War, where Union forces, despite overwhelming industrial superiority, had been repeatedly stymied by supply line vulnerabilities. They had analyzed the First World War, where British and French offensives had ground to halt after halt, not for lack of courage but for lack of shells, food, fodder, fuel. They had watched the American performance in North Africa, where Eisenhower's forces had struggled with supply coordination, despite operating from established ports against relatively modest opposition. Every historical precedent, every calculation, every strategic model pointed to the same conclusion. The invasion would exhaust itself. The Americans would advance perhaps 50, perhaps 70 kilometers inland. Then their supplies would begin to lag. Their tanks would sit idle for want of fuel. Their artillery would fall silent for want of shells. Their infantry would slow, then stop, then begin the long, familiar retreat that all armies make when the supply wagons empty. Except they didn't. Richter had watched the American columns advance with a speed that violated every principle of logistics he had been taught at the Kriegsacademy. They moved not like an army racing ahead of its supply lines, but like an army that carried its supply lines with it, that generated them from thin air, that seemed to exist in a state of permanent, impossible abundance. His own Wehrmacht units had been retreating on half rations, then quarter rations, then no rations at all, subsisting on what they could forage from already depleted French farmsteads. Meanwhile, American soldiers ate hot meals prepared in mobile kitchens that followed 3 kilometers behind the front lines. They ate eggs. They ate meat. They ate vegetables shipped from across an ocean, preserved in tin cans that themselves represented an industrial miracle Germany could no longer replicate. The Americans threw away more food in a single day than a German division received in a week. This was not propaganda. This was not exaggeration. Richter had seen it with his own eyes. On June 10th, his reconnaissance unit had overrun a hastily abandoned American supply depot near St. Lo. What they found inside had shaken even the most hardened veterans. Stacks of wooden crates containing chocolate bars, each one individually wrapped. Cartons of cigarettes, not the ersatz tobacco made from cabbage leaves and hope that German soldiers smoked, but real American tobacco. Tins of coffee, real coffee, not the acorn and chicory substitute that passed for coffee in the Reich, but ground beans that filled the air with an aroma so rich it made grown men weep. There were canned peaches, canned pears, condensed milk, powdered eggs, instant soup mixes, and bread, loaves upon loaves of white bread, soft and fresh despite having crossed an ocean and a battle line. The German soldiers had fallen on this depot like starving wolves, stuffing their pockets and packs with food they hadn't seen in years. One Unteroffizier had sat on the ground eating an entire tin of peaches with his fingers, weeping quietly as the sweet juice ran down his chin. Another had carefully wrapped 6 chocolate bars in his spare socks, whispering that he would send them home to his children in Dresden, though the chances of anything reaching Dresden through the Allied bombing campaign were nearly zero. But it was what the Americans had left behind that had truly shocked Richter. When his men inventoried the depot, they found that this abundance, this impossible, overwhelming bounty, represented less than 2 days' worth of supplies for a single American regiment. Not a division, a regiment, and the Americans had abandoned it without a second thought because they knew with absolute certainty that more was already coming, that there would always be more, that the pipeline stretching back across France, across the Channel, across the Atlantic to the factories of Detroit, and the farms of Iowa was not a fragile thread that could be cut, but a river in flood, unstoppable and inexhaustible. The German generals had expected the Americans to fight with the desperation of men far from home, rationing every bullet, hoarding every can of food, advancing cautiously to preserve their tenuous supply lines. Instead, the Americans fought with the confidence of men who knew that whatever they expended would be replaced by morning. They fired artillery barrages that consumed more shells in an hour than a German division received in a month. They called in airstrikes with a casual profligacy that suggested the bombs themselves cost nothing. They drove their tanks forward knowing that if one broke down, another would arrive to replace it. They advanced not despite their supply situation, but because of it, because abundance itself had become a weapon more devastating than any gun. This was a kind of warfare the Germans had never encountered, never imagined, never prepared for. This was not the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front, where both sides bled each other white in the snow. This was not the calculated chess match of North Africa, where Rommel and Montgomery had maneuvered for position like Renaissance princes counting every soldier. This was industrial warfare raised to a level that transcended strategy and entered the realm of the sublime. The Americans were not fighting a war. They were demonstrating a capacity so vast, so overwhelming, that resistance itself became a kind of logical absurdity. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, would later write in his memoirs. By June 15th, I knew we had lost, though I did not yet have the words to explain how I knew. It was not the American firepower, though that was formidable. It was not their air superiority, though that was devastating. It was something I saw in the face of a 19-year-old American sergeant who was guarding me after my capture. He was eating a sandwich, white bread, real butter, thick slices of ham, and when I stared at it, he offered me half without hesitation, without thought, as though food was so abundant that sharing it cost him nothing. In that moment, I understood that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting an economy, an industrial base, a civilization that could feed its soldiers sandwiches with real butter in the middle of a battlefield 6,000 kilometers from home, and think nothing of it. The bread in Richter's hand had gone cold, but he continued to hold it, continued to study it. It was not military-grade hardtack. It was not the dense, dark rye bread of Germany, baked to last weeks in a soldier's pack. This was the soft white bread of peacetime, of abundance, of a nation so wealthy it could afford to ship trivialities across an ocean. The Americans were feeding their soldiers the bread of home, not the bread of war. And in that simple fact lay a truth that all the strategic planning, all the maps and calculations and German military genius could not overcome. The war had been won and lost not at Normandy, but in the wheat fields of Kansas and the factories of Pittsburgh. It had been decided not by generals, but by farmers and factory workers who would never see Europe, never hear a shot fired in anger. It had been determined by a nation that could simultaneously feed an army in France, supply an army in the Pacific, maintain its civilian population in comfort, and still have surplus enough to lend to its allies under programs like Lend-Lease. Germany had begun the war with a 4-year stockpile of fuel and a carefully calculated reserve of food. By 1944, those reserves were exhausted. The Wehrmacht was running its vehicles on synthetic fuel that destroyed engines within months. German soldiers were eating bread made from potatoes mixed with sawdust. The civilian population was on starvation rations, and even those rations were increasingly theoretical, paper promises with nothing behind them. The entire war economy had become a vast, elaborate shell game, where resources were shifted from one crisis to another, borrowed from tomorrow to pay for today, held together by nothing more substantial than will and terror and the fading myth of German invincibility. The Americans, meanwhile, were eating better in combat than German civilians were eating at home. On June 18, 1944, an American logistics officer named Colonel John C.H. Lee held a press conference at his headquarters in Southampton. Lee was the commander of the Communications Zone, the vast re-echelon organization responsible for Allied supply operations in Europe. He was not a combat officer. He would never be celebrated as a hero, never have his name attached to any great battle or dramatic victory. But in many ways, Lee and men like him had done more to win the war than any general. Lee laid out the numbers with the calm precision of an accountant discussing quarterly earnings. The Allied forces in Normandy were consuming, on average, 700 tons of supplies per division per day. With 30 divisions in the field or en route, that meant over 20,000 tons of supplies needed to cross the English Channel every single day. Food alone accounted for 3,000 tons daily, roughly 100 pounds of food per soldier per day, when you included the full logistical chain from farms to front lines. 20,000 tons per day meant over 600,000 tons per month, meant trucks and ships and warehouses and inventory systems, and the cold mathematics of abundance scaled to levels that defied imagination. Lee explained how Liberty ships were being unloaded in under 24 hours at artificial harbors, the Mulberry harbors, that the Allies had towed across the Channel and assembled on the French coast. He described the Red Ball Express, and convoy system that would soon operate 29,000 vehicles on a closed-loop highway, delivering supplies to the front 24 hours a day. He detailed the pipeline being laid across the channel to pump fuel directly from England to France, eliminating the need for tanker ships. When a British journalist asked if the supply situation was sustainable, Lee had smiled. "Sustainable, son, we're just getting started." This was not bravado. This was simple fact. American industrial production in 1944 was so vast that it exceeded the combined output of all other combatant nations, Axis and Allied, combined. The United States was producing one merchant ship every 8 hours, one tank every 4 minutes, one aircraft every 5 minutes. It was growing food on an agricultural base so productive that it was simultaneously feeding its own population, its military, and half of Europe, and still managing to maintain strategic reserves. The German generals had calculated correctly that no nation could sustain such an effort. What they had failed to calculate was that America was not like other nations. It was not operating at the edge of its capacity, straining every resource to maintain the war effort. It was operating at a fraction of its potential, and that fraction alone was enough to overwhelm the combined might of the Third Reich. Oberst Helmut Lang, chief logistics officer for the 7th Army, was captured on June 22 while attempting to requisition fuel from a depot that existed only on paper. In his interrogation, he was shown the American supply reports. He was shown the tonnage figures, the shipping schedules, the inventory lists. He read them 3 times, certain there must be an error, a misplaced decimal point, some fundamental mistake in translation. "This is impossible," he said finally. "No army in history has operated at this scale." His American interrogator, a captain from Brooklyn who spoke fluent German, had shrugged. "We're not like other armies. We don't do things the way they've always been done. We do them the way they ought to be done, and then we figure out how to make that work." It was a very American answer, pragmatic, confident, almost naive in its optimism. But it was an answer backed by the material reality of 20,000 tons of supplies flowing across the channel every single day, by hot meals served to soldiers in the middle of a battle, by chocolate bars and coffee and white bread that never ran out. The German strategic assumption had been that democracies were weak, that their decision-making was slow, that their industries were inefficient, that their soldiers were soft. Hitler himself had said, "Americans are good at making refrigerators and razor blades. They are not good at making war." This assessment was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what made America powerful. The Germans had looked at American consumer culture, the automobiles, the radios, the endless array of manufactured goods, and seen it as a sign of decadence, of a nation grown fat and lazy on peacetime plenty. What they failed to understand was that the same industrial capacity that made refrigerators and razor blades could, with frightening speed, be converted to making tanks and bullets. The same logistics networks that distributed consumer goods to millions of American homes could distribute ammunition to millions of American soldiers. The same culture of mass production, standardization, and efficiency that seemed so pedestrian, so lacking in the romantic grandeur of German military tradition, was precisely what made American power so overwhelming. Germany had artisan gunsmiths handcrafting precision weapons. America had assembly lines stamping out millions of serviceable rifles that worked well enough and could be replaced instantly. Germany had brilliant engineers designing sophisticated tanks that required hours of maintenance and specialized parts. America had good enough engineers designing Sherman tanks that were inferior in many respects to German armor, but could be produced in such vast quantities that the ratio became meaningless. Germany had a warrior culture that celebrated individual heroism and tactical brilliance. America had a logistics culture that celebrated efficiency and throughput and getting the job done. In the arithmetic of total war, the logistics culture won. By late June, the pattern was clear. German units in Normandy were not being defeated in pitched battles. They were dissolving through attrition, through starvation, through the simple mathematics of expenditure without replacement. A panzer division that lost 20 tanks in a day's fighting could not replace those tanks. An American armored division that lost 20 tanks would have 30 new tanks arrive by the end of the week. A German infantry company that consumed its basic load of ammunition in a firefight had to wait days or weeks for resupply. An American infantry company that expended its ammunition could call for more and have it delivered by truck within hours. The Americans were not better soldiers, man for man, than their German counterparts. If anything, the Wehrmacht in 1944 still maintained a tactical edge in small unit tactics, in combined arms coordination, in the kind of military professionalism that came from years of brutal warfare. But tactics meant nothing when your soldiers were hungry, and your tanks had no fuel, and your artillery had no shells. Skill meant nothing when the enemy could afford to make mistakes and learn from them, because they had infinite second chances, infinite resources, infinite capacity to absorb losses and keep advancing. General Major Richter understood this now, standing in that farmhouse outside Caen with his piece of American bread. The bread was a symbol, but it was also an explanation. It represented the answer to the question that had haunted German planning since 1940. How do you defeat an enemy that doesn't have to choose between guns and butter, because they have enough to make both? The answer, he realized, was that you don't. You can't. The war had been lost the moment Germany decided to fight not just the British Empire, not just the Soviet Union, but also the one nation on Earth whose productive capacity was so vast that it existed outside the normal calculations of warfare. Germany had brought a sword to a gunfight. The Americans had brought a factory. Throughout July and August, as the Allies broke out from Normandy and swept across France, German commanders repeatedly encountered the same pattern. They would establish defensive positions, prepare for the grinding attritional battle they understood, husband their limited resources for a calculated defense. And then the Americans would simply overwhelm them with materiel. Artillery barrages that lasted hours, consuming more ammunition than a German division had seen in months. Air strikes that arrived within minutes of being called, dropping bombs with such profligacy that the very earth seemed to be liquefying. Tank attacks that kept coming, wave after wave, because for every Sherman destroyed, 2 more appeared on the horizon. And behind it all, sustaining it all, was the supply system, that vast, impersonal, unstoppable river of materiel that made everything else possible. The Americans built field hospitals with running water and electric lights. They established bakeries that produced fresh bread daily for thousands of soldiers. They set up ice cream factories, within artillery range of the front lines. They distributed mail from home with a regularity that seemed like sorcery. They provided cigarettes and candy and chewing gum, and 1,000 other small comforts that had no tactical value but immense psychological impact. German soldiers, when captured, consistently spoke of being demoralized not by American firepower but by American abundance. They spoke of the shame of surrendering not because they were outfought, but because they were outsupplied. They spoke of the sheer, crushing weight of facing an enemy that clearly had access to resources beyond anything they had imagined possible. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, captured near Falaise in August, would later describe his final days in combat. We had not eaten a proper meal in 6 days. We had been retreating constantly, always one step ahead of American armor, watching our supply trucks get destroyed by American aircraft, watching our depots burn, watching everything we needed to continue fighting simply evaporate under American bombing. On my last day of freedom, my men and I found a small stream and filled our canteens. We had no food. We had perhaps 30 rounds of ammunition between 8 men. We knew the Americans were close. We could hear their vehicles, that endless sound of engines that never stopped, never rested. And then we smelled food, cooking food, real food. The smell of meat and coffee carried on the wind from the American positions, perhaps half a kilometer away. One of my men, a boy from Munich who had been with me since Normandy, began to cry, not from fear, not from exhaustion, from hunger, from the knowledge that the enemy was eating hot meals while we starved. I ordered a withdrawal, but 3 of my men walked toward the American lines instead. They chose captivity and food over freedom and starvation. I could not blame them. I almost joined them. The great German generals had planned for many contingencies. They had wargamed Soviet offensives and British invasions and partisan uprisings and strategic bombing campaigns. They had calculated fuel reserves and ammunition expenditures and replacement rates. They had studied Napoleon and Frederick and Clausewitz. They had prepared for the kind of warfare they understood, the warfare of maneuver and position, of tactical brilliance and strategic calculation, of armies led by generals and sustained by the will to fight. What they had not prepared for was an enemy whose fundamental approach to warfare was so alien to their own experience that it might as well have come from another planet. The Americans did not fight like Europeans. They fought like industrialists. They approached warfare as a problem of production and distribution, of logistics and efficiency, of overwhelming material superiority applied with mechanical precision. They were not trying to outthink their opponents. They were trying to outproduce them, to bury them under such a weight of material that thought itself became irrelevant. And it worked. By September 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris, crossed the Seine, and were approaching the German border. They had advanced further in 3 months than the Germans had calculated they could advance in a year. The Wehrmacht in the West was shattered, not defeated in any single great battle, but simply ground down, worn away, dissolved by the relentless arithmetic of a supply situation that favored one side absolutely. German units that had begun the Normandy campaign with 10,000 men now fielded a few hundred. Panzer divisions that should have had 200 tanks operated with 20. The German army in France was not retreating. It was disintegrating. And yet, and this was perhaps the most devastating realization of all, the Americans were barely straining. Their supply system had encountered difficulties, certainly. The Red Ball Express was pushing the limits of what trucks could accomplish, and the advance had occasionally outrun its fuel supplies. But these were temporary problems, solved within days or weeks. The fundamental capacity of the American supply system remained vast and largely untapped. Lee and his logistics officers were already planning for what came next: the crossing of the Rhine, the invasion of Germany itself, operations that would require even more supplies delivered even further from the beaches of Normandy. They were confident they could do it, and they were right. Generalmajor Wilhelm Richter spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp in Oklahoma. He was treated, by the standards of the time, remarkably well. The camp was clean, the guards were professional, and most importantly, the food was abundant. 3 meals a day every day without fail, white bread, real coffee, meat more than once a week, vegetables, fruit. He gained 20 pounds in his first 3 months of captivity, recovering from the slow starvation that had been his constant companion for the previous 2 years. He spent long hours in the camp library, reading American magazines and newspapers, trying to understand the nation that had defeated him. He read about American farms that used tractors and combines and produced yields per acre that were double or triple what German farms achieved. He read about American factories that operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts of workers producing goods with an efficiency German industry could only dream of. He read about the American home front, where rationing existed, but was relatively mild compared to the desperate privations of Germany, where civilians complained about butter shortages while still eating better than Wehrmacht soldiers in the field. He came to understand, slowly and painfully, that the war had been unwinnable from the start, not because of German tactical or strategic mistakes, though those certainly existed, not because of Hitler's madness, though that too had played its part, but because Germany had chosen to fight an enemy whose capacity for production was so vast that no amount of German efficiency or tactical brilliance could overcome it. It was as though they had challenged the ocean to a wrestling match. They could fight brilliantly, courageously, even win individual engagements, but the tide would come in regardless, and in the end they would drown. The piece of white bread he'd held that morning outside Caen had told him everything he needed to know about the outcome of the war. He simply hadn't wanted to believe it. In 1946, after the war ended, the United States Army's Quartermaster Corps published a detailed report on logistics operations in the European theater. The numbers were staggering. The Americans had transported over 7 million tons of supplies across the Atlantic to Europe. They had operated the largest trucking operation in history, with over 300,000 vehicles on European roads at peak. They had established supply depots that covered more square miles than some European cities. They had fed, clothed, armed, and sustained over 3 million soldiers on a front that stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe, and they had done it all while simultaneously conducting even larger operations in the Pacific theater against Japan. The report concluded with a simple observation. The campaign in Europe demonstrated that modern warfare is fundamentally a problem of logistics. The side that can sustain greater forces in the field for longer periods will ultimately prevail, regardless of tactical considerations. This was the lesson that the German generals had learned too late. This was the truth that Richter had seen in that piece of white bread. Warfare in the industrial age was not about glory or heroism or tactical brilliance, though those still mattered. It was about capacity, the capacity to produce, to transport, to distribute, to sustain. It was about transforming the latent power of a nation's economy into the kinetic power of armed force. And in that transformation, America had no equal. The bread was the symbol because bread was fundamental. It was the most basic necessity of any army, the foundation upon which everything else rested. An army without bread was not an army. It was a mob of starving men waiting to dissolve. And the Americans had crossed an ocean, fought their way onto a hostile shore, advanced hundreds of kilometers into enemy territory and still managed to provide their soldiers with fresh white bread. Not hardtack, not emergency rations, not the bitter bread of desperation, but the soft, sweet bread of abundance, of home, of a nation that could afford to care about such trivialities even in the midst of total war. That was the war the Germans lost. Not the war of tactics or strategy or courage or skill, but the war of wheat and steel and oil, and all the mundane, unglamorous elements that sustained armies in the field. They had prepared to fight the last war, the war they understood, the war of tactical genius and operational art. Instead, they encountered something new, the war of industrial capacity, where victory went not to the most brilliant general but to the most productive economy. And in that war they never stood a chance. The sun was rising fully now over the Norman hedgerows. Richter could hear voices outside, American voices, speaking in that flat Midwestern accent that he'd learned to recognize. Someone was laughing. Someone else was complaining about the coffee, though even their complaint carried a tone of casual abundance that would have seemed obscene on the Eastern Front. These were men who had the luxury of complaining about their coffee being too weak, their bread being slightly stale, their rations being boring. These were men who had never known real hunger, real deprivation, the kind of existential want that reduced human beings to animals fighting over scraps. And they were the victors. Richter looked down at the bread in his hand one last time, then ate it. It was still good, even cold. It tasted like defeat, like the future, like the world that would emerge from this war. A world where American power would be measured not in divisions or battleships, but in grain yields and factory outputs, in the quiet, overwhelming capacity to produce more of everything than any other nation on earth. The bread was the symbol, but the bread was also just bread. And that perhaps was the most devastating thing of all.